brain, and it just blew me up like you've never seen before.
That I wouldn't a million years say that.
That's what comprehensive. And then
All right, everyone. Welcome to tonight's planning board meeting. It is August 25th, 5:31. Take roll call. Or, do you want me to take roll call? We don't need roll call? No. All right, cool. It looks like the only item on tonight's agenda is a presentation from Orion Planning and Design for the zoning ordinance update. So I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Great, thank you. And now that I said no roll call, maybe if I could get everybody's names so that I know who I'm talking to, and then we'll introduce ourselves and you know who you'll be talking to. Would that be okay?
Yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I guess I'll start. Matt Steitzer.
Mike McLeod.
Sean Ori.
And I recognize many of you from the planning process, but it's just good to get a refresher. So, Allison Mauk, partner and planner with Orion Planning and Design. I'm joined tonight by three of my partners and colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves. As you may recall, I'm based out of Missoula. They are not, and you'll be able to tell right quick. So, Bert.
I'm Bert Kirkendall, engineer and planner out of Chattanooga, Tennessee.
I'm Bob Barber. I'm a planner, a partner with Orion. I'm based in Memphis, Tennessee.
I'm Oliver Siebold, urban designer, and I'm based in St. Simons Island, Georgia.
And oddly enough, they've all complained about the heat this week. So, so we're really delighted to be back here with you all as we begin the process to update the county's zoning code, Title 17. Tonight's presentation is a pretty loose term. We'll take no more than an hour of your time, and it's really intended to be more of a discussion. I'm just going to walk through kind of what we have been doing this week. And then we have a couple of questions for you all based on your experience so far with the zoning regulations, but also tying back into the comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2020 and the Uptown Master Plan that was just recently adopted. You know, it's no surprise that those two documents are really our marching orders in a lot of ways for this update. And we want to hear from you all what your priorities are and kind of your experiences, positive, negative, and otherwise, with the zoning code and the development review process here in Butte-Silver. So that's sort of the order of go this evening. As a refresher, you know, we work with city and county governments all over the United States on audit processes and code updates, much like this one. We recently completed an update in Missoula County and are working nationally on codes that will hopefully inform our work here in terms of bringing some best practices to Butte-Silver for your consideration. But what we started out with this week, and what we start every audit process with, and I forgot how awkward this seat is, so my apologies as I continue to swivel. But what was that? Well, I know, but then my back's to, yeah. So we start every audit process with a pretty in-depth review of the code itself that our team conducts, but we're also reviewing that in line with staff. So we got here Monday, spent all day Tuesday going through section by section the code with Dylan and Lila and Joella and really understanding some of what they've been experiencing. We then spent the day yesterday with a group of external stakeholders. We met with the development community, we met with the real estate community, representatives, of course, from each. We met with recent applicants and the design community, architects, engineers, consultants that do a lot of work in Butte-Silver and got their respective takes on how the code is working and not working. And this is all intended to build sort of a body of evidence in terms of priorities for the update based on where we're seeing a lot of similarities and struggles and priorities for what needs to change in the code. So the audit report that we'll be compiling in the coming months is going to summarize those findings as well as our professional review. We're going to follow up the conversations we've had this week with a survey to expand that lens a little bit and hear from a broader swath of key stakeholders. But in effect, I think the key takeaways from the last 48 hours are, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to step in if I miss anything. There's a lot of similarities we're hearing from pretty much every stakeholder, staff and external, that I'm going to say this as nicely as possible. The code's quite old, quite old, has not been comprehensively updated since its adoption in the 70s. It's a code that, when it was applied, you are not able to do the things, develop in a manner like has traditionally occurred in Uptown. You can't do the things that you might want to do to recreate the fabric of the community given the code that you have. It's a code that's created a lot of nonconformity in its application, and that nonconformity is creating a lot of headaches in terms of variances and review process and inconsistencies in administration. And so that seems to be an issue that is permeating much of our conversation, just sort of how we have this monster that's creating problems. For instance, the minimum lot square footage requirement. Most lots in Uptown Butte are non-conforming right out the gate because the minimum lot size is 6,000 square feet and you have very tiny lots. So that restricts right away what you're capable of doing on those lots. So that's, we're seeing issues and we're hearing issues that from a code writing perspective are very easily dealt with. And as you'll recall, for those of you involved in the comprehensive planning process, when we started talking about the concept of place and character, one of the reasons for doing that was to create a palette of future land use that really respected the unique qualities that exist throughout Butte-Silver Bow. So for instance, you have R1 zoning up on the hill here, and you have R1 zoning down in the flats, and it's the same district applied to two extremely distinct and different areas. The comprehensive plan and the Uptown master plan provide us the guidance to start to think about additional districts that might be needed to reflect what you want to see Uptown versus what you want to see in the flats in terms of the development character. I'm trying to think what other highlights did we hear? Yep, talked a lot about infrastructure, a lot about sidewalks, connectivity, kind of how that plays into the development review process, some of the redundancies that exist between sets of regulations that you have. You have subdivision regulations, you have zoning regulations, you have floodplain regulations, you have street design standards that are part of public works. And just within, not necessarily floodplain, but subdivision zoning and the public works standards, you've got conflicting or redundant sets of design standards for streets and roads in the county. So while we are not charged with an update to the subdivision regulations or the public works standards, through this audit review, we're going to be looking at those related regulations to provide staff and yourselves with some guidance on future updates and alignment that you might take under consideration as a result of this process.
I have a question. Point of order. Would our guests in the board prefer any questions we might have as we go along, or at the end of your presentation? Which would you prefer?
I'm happy to have it be a discourse and as we go along.
As we go along?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So one real quick question. You mentioned 6,000 square feet is what we have an ordinance for here right now. You mentioned other cities are different. What would Bozeman and Missoula and similar cities of Butte's size and structure, what would their ordinance be for square footage?
It definitely varies. Oliver, were you gonna jump in, or you're just playing with the microphone? Okay. So in the city of Missoula, for instance, the smallest square footage lot, I think, is 3,000 to 3,500 square feet in downtown. I mean, that's a scalable urban lot. The related issue with the lot size is the bulk and dimensional requirements for setback. You know, you create a smaller building envelope when you apply setbacks to an already small, undersized lot. And a lot of urban areas like Missoula and Bozeman and Helena, downtown Helena, we worked on their code a number of years ago, implement zero lot line requirements. So allowing the building code to inform in terms of fire safety standards. But theoretically, if you have a firewall, you could build up to your property line, so you're not as restricted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a quick question, if I could. Can I hear okay? I never know how to turn it off. Doesn't matter. So just a point of clarification, is the scope of your assignment to rewrite this or to have suggestions for us to rewrite it, or us being Butte-Silver?
Both. Well, I mean, yes. The first part of this process, the next 3 months or so, are going to be providing you with those recommendations where we're going to say, here are the priorities in rewriting the code, and here's how we suggest going about it, to get your thumbs up and the commissioner's thumbs up on moving forward then with the update. And then once the update, we're not expecting you to rewrite the code. We will then rewrite the code, but we want there to be a roadmap and buy-in so that when we're saying, yeah, this doesn't really make sense, and here's why, and here's what we heard, and professional best practice suggests we do X, Y, and Z, there's a rationale behind that you understand for why we're making the change, and that can then be conveyed to the public as well through the update process.
And how long do you anticipate the process to take?
Well,
On your end?
yeah.
I guess I should say.
So on our end, I think we have a time frame for both the audit and the update of about 14 months, and that's fairly aggressive to get to the point of the adoption process. So I think in a perfect world, we would be sitting here at this time next year talking about beginning that formal adoption. There's a lot of factors that come into play, not least of which, and I'm sure you're all aware on one level or another of the conversations happening at the state level related to zoning and the Subdivision and Platting Act. And so there might be some changes to state statute that come out of the legislative session next spring that will kind of be working on this code update and making sure we're also aware of how those changes will impact the process. So,
Just one last question.
yeah.
So when you've done this in other communities, have you had resistance from any one sector? And if it, whether it be the staff, the public, the professional, surveyor type folks, or is it usually pretty seamless and well accepted?
I think I have experienced both. I think we could give you examples of where an update has gone very smoothly, Missoula County being one of those. The stakeholders were brought along through the process, and they kind of understood, and we had a lot of buy-in from the real estate community, from the development community, and from the design community. And we actually, in our conversations yesterday, we're asking the stakeholders, you know, if we come out of this process with a document that you feel is better than where we started, are you willing to, you know, support that through the adoption process and kind of be an advocate for the work that's been done? And I think everybody was very positive and felt like that was an ask they could respect. If
Where'd your pushback come from?
Oh, so the pushback usually comes from the public, and that's why it's really important to us that as we begin the update, that we bring the public along and are explaining the changes and why the changes are happening. One point of clarification is that what we will be working on is the code itself. We, as part of this process, we won't actually be changing any zoning map boundaries. We want to get the framework in place, and then staff will be working as we're working to kind of identify where the map changes are going to need to occur. And typically that's where the greatest pushback comes, because then you're changing lines, you're changing boundaries. It has an impact on property owners, and it's really important that they understand what that means. So I wouldn't say, I can't think, and I can't see Bob, but I have never, most of the pushback comes from just a lack of understanding, and so education is a really important part of this process. Yeah. But that being said, if you are aware of groups or people, individuals, business owners that are going to have concerns and that we need to engage early on to you know, really address things head on, that would be really helpful. You know, you're essentially our steering committee for this. So as much as you can help us identify where we're going to find that pushback, that's going to be helpful along the way.
Maybe some of these guys that are here now weren't around when we did the comprehensive plan and like pushback we got from the meetings like Ramsey and Melrose. So if you could just tell them so they know that they've done a really good job with the ones before, and then the way she said that, we'll go out to some of these meetings, we can all attend them also and talk to the public. And when we did those in the outline areas for the comprehensive plan, it worked really good. Try to visit with people and listen to their concerns. So.
And for Melrose in that area specifically, it's going to be really important that they understand that this process is not going to zone them. We will create a palette where if a community or an individual in an unzoned area of the county chooses to come in and wants to be zoned, they have a district that is, you know, those rural working lands place types that reflects the goals of that, which is essentially to limit development and keep a very rural character. But we are not proactively going out and zoning any part of the county that is not currently zoned. So, yeah, I'm not sure that got at what you wanted me to get at in terms of talking about that process. But yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When there's the public meetings, any of us can go to them too and talk.
Absolutely.
If we want when they do this.
And as we get into that stage, it will be really important that as planning board members and hopefully advocates for the code that comes out on the other end, you are participants in that process so that the public and our stakeholders can see that you're invested in kind of where we're trying to get to. So we'll probably make that ask as we we start to draft. I guess I should just keep it on. So in terms of the time frame, I think we kind of covered that. Your role as we move forward, just so you're kind of aware of, I appreciate you all being here on one of the last remaining breaths of summer before it becomes winter in Butte. But your role at this stage in the process, after tonight, will be, we'll come to you again with those recommendations as part of the audit. We'll keep you updated as we begin the drafting process, kind of where we're at, what we're addressing. When we have a full preliminary draft that's been vetted by staff, we will be coming to you for your review, and we'll probably spend a couple of meetings time going through the draft document, but that will probably not be until early next year, first quarter of next year, that you will be asked to do homework on the draft. When we're in that drafting process, it'll be a little bit more intensive. And then as we move through that and into the spring and begin to engage the public and begin that educational process, like I said, it would be great to have your participation and support. Sorry, I'm looking at Dylan. So any questions about that? Any questions about what? Yeah.
So, quick question, how will you envision much for public meetings then along the process? I mean, I kind of listening to how this is going to lay out, but it is a little bit different than when we updated the old growth policy. So, you'd say you won't necessarily be reaching out to those that are in unzoned areas, but that probably was long over the last year. So, will there be much for direct public outreach, like public meetings type like that?
There will be, but what we've found is that whereas the planning process is higher level, it's very visionary, we're talking about goals and what people want to see. Code is where the rubber meets the road, and it's quite technical, and the average layperson, unless they've had an experience with a permitting process or are in the profession, they're very focused on what is this going to do to my property? How does this impact me? And we can answer those questions a lot better when we have a draft that staff has is on board with, that you all are on board with, and that we can go to the public and actually walk through some of those what if questions. So I would say there will be public engagement when we get to the audit recommendations so that we can explain to them what we're about to embark upon and do some Q&A and have an open house and kind of talk through questions and concerns. We'll be re-engaging our stakeholders as well with those recommendations. And then there will probably be a break. We'll have a project website that the public can kind of understand what's happening in real time, but the interface with the public won't be again until we have a draft that we can talk through rather than concepts, actualities. And then that will be a more robust process. And I think it will probably need to include meetings in the areas that are unzoned so they understand what we are doing and what we are not doing, and just make sure that conversation is crystal clear. Because they might, someone might be interested in considering zoning down the road, but we want to make absolutely clear to the public at large that this is not countywide zoning. This, that's not on the table. This is looking at the areas within Butte-Silver that are zoned today and how that changes. It's, yeah.
I was just going to reinforce Allison's point that the code process is guided by the plan. And so in theory, if the community's very happy with the plan, you have a good plan, the code is going to reflect that plan in theory. So assuming that path proceeds, and we would expect it to, it should be minimal pushback from what's happening.
And then I'll just add to that, a real key process is this audit that we're going to be going through. And it's not only making recommendations, but it's identifying problems. And that will all be together in the report. And so that's a key educational piece for the public to say, we need to address this issue because X, Y, or Z. And from what we found with the groups, the stakeholders we met with yesterday, as you might guess, some people are a little on edge, just, what's going on. But as we sat and talked with them, and, there was basically an agreement, the code has issues, and the fact that we're here to try to identify those and justify them and correct them, everyone pretty much had a very positive attitude and was excited about that it was happening.
Airflow's overrated. So in the half hour or so that we've scheduled that's left, I know many of you were involved in the comprehensive plan update and went through that with our team. The Uptown Master Plan update that's just been officially recognized as an arm of that plan. There's a lot of overlapping goals and priorities of both. And I'm curious to hear from you all what your priority improvements to the code would be based on what came out of those two processes. And
I'll jump in here for a minute. Just with a background in civil and working with the code and zoning, also with what we've heard from a lot of different applicants, the maybe thousands of zoning change requests that staff's had to deal with over the years, stuff like that. I think you touched on it, Allison. It was the rural versus urban or uptown versus downtown zoning and how that affects developments. Sidewalks a great one that always comes up. Urban subdivisions versus rural subdivisions. I think that's always been a hot topic, and usually, in some of our rural areas, we're seeing requests for variances from that. Setbacks is a big one that always seems to come up, and I think, again, depending on the area, sometimes some lots don't have room for enough setbacks. So I just kind of wonder about how we can better serve the area that the zoning's being applied to. And then a hot topic for me is lighting. It just seems like it's kind of a free-for-all on site lighting and things of that nature, and how that impacts some of our residents. We hear a lot of that out in the TIFID, Buxton being out there and stuff. So I'm just thinking of some of those people that have been at our planning board meetings over the last few years and complaints that they've had and concerns and what they can and can't do about it. But yeah, mainly my main point there would be the rural versus urban areas, the uptown versus downtown, and how that's impacted by zoning.
And I should have mentioned, we spent much of the day today just kind of tooling around the zoned areas of the city and county and evaluating. Bob created a really neat app where we could see real time what zone we were in based on where we were driving, which was very helpful. And, you know, I've spent more time here than my colleagues, but it was surprising to me moving through different parts of the city that we'd be in an area classified as R1, and the density felt more like it should in R4, and then you'd get to an area classified as R1, or R4, and it felt like R2. I mean, there's a lot of there's just not a lot of rhyme or reason to where the districts land when you start to get on the ground, and it's like, well, what differentiates that as being R1 and the property across the street is R4, and they look exactly the same and character-wise, and I mean, you have a lot of unique, I mean, you're not Bozeman, you're not Missoula, topography-wise, the history of how the community's developed, how the lots have come to be. So there's a lot of unique qualities that are going to require some pretty unique responses.
So Allison, how do you correct that? And, you know, if you have a blank canvas out on the flats and there's some open areas and things, it seems to me that'd be easier. But when you've already got developed, you know, what do you do? I mean,
Well, so the fabric of Uptown, I'll just take Uptown as because it's the hardest. Yeah. I think first I mean, right out the gate, we look at the minimum lot size requirements and just the basic bulk and dimensional requirements. And I think based on the Uptown Master Plan's goals, the feeling of the community is they want to maintain the historic fabric that has been so important to Uptown Butte and the National Historic Area. So looking at how to tweak the districts that exist or create additional districts to reflect kind of those nuanced neighborhoods. The west side's a little bit different than the east side when you get down into Greeley and the racetrack area. So there's some pretty, I want to say easy, but nothing's ever that easy, but there's some pretty straightforward modifications to be made just to those size requirements that would alleviate a lot of the nonconformities that exist.
so in my mind, I'm thinking you're going to an area. Is it more of a suggestion of a new district so that everything that is there now will comply with the new district? Or
That's one of the objectives, yes. And it might not be a new district. It might be working within the parameters of an existing district. I think there's going to be a combination of both, to be quite frank, just how we're starting to look at this. I also think that part of the challenge in Butte has been none of the zones really effectively allow for a mix of uses or for multiple uses on a site without having to go through a process or request, or, you know, there are things that we can do to change the allowable uses to create neighborhoods that function like they traditionally would, where you have a corner grocery and where you have a cafe, or you have some of the services that aren't impacting residents negatively, but they're reflective of how Butte originated, and they're not creating additional process for people to have to go through to develop. I think
When you come in and change and rezone and add and subtract, there must be a great deal of grandfathering going on. If somebody comes, they've been there for 40 years, and you come in and change their zone and they don't conform with you must have to grandfather a great deal of people in.
grandfathering absolutely happens, and that's your code right now does not have terribly clear grandfathering provisions, so that's something we would probably bolster so that it's very clear that if you exist on the date that this code is adopted, you get to continue to exist, no problem, no worries. But part of that is also expanding what's allowed by right in some of these districts where it's appropriate. And then it doesn't matter if you were a non-conforming use or a conforming use. We want to reduce as much of that need for grandfathering as possible by creating a more flexible code that doesn't make you a legally non-conforming use because we've changed something in the zoning. So that we're very aware of that when we start to look at changes to districts, in not creating more problems and trying to alleviate the inconsistencies that exist.
Yeah, and I guess just to speak to that too, but with Butte having the largest historic district in the country, it's ironic that the code basically prohibits the historic preservation of the original character, because a lot of these lots in Uptown were platted at 30 by 100 feet, and it's very clear without setbacks, but the code does not reflect. It's actually prohibitive in trying to keep the character. So everything we do is going to be context sensitive to the place, and looking, what is there. We're not trying to necessarily fix everything, but basically we're trying to align the code with more of what Butte's character has been traditionally. But the code that is in place now is very prohibitive of that to occur. So that's going to be one of the main things we're going to try to do.
Dylan?
I'm sorry, I don't want to just jump into, but the way I think of it is the code that we have now is very boilerplate, and Butte is not. So what's going to come out of this is going to be, when you talk grandfathering, we call that like a non-conforming use. There's going to be a lot less non-conforming uses when we're done than when we started. And that's the goal. There's probably going to be a few, but the way that the zoning code works is that non-conforming uses are intended to be phased out. And when the code that we have now is very not matching what was constructed or the goals. If you think Butte doesn't, right now it would force you to change, and Butte doesn't really want to change in character. So if the code matches the character, then there won't be that forcing to change, with those non-conforming uses. So it's probably going to be actually the opposite of that. It's going to be a lot more freedom for those that are non-conforming now.
Not to belabor, but I was going to toss out an example. So in the plan, there is a place type called the Uptown Edge. So on the edge of Uptown, there's a different character that the current code does not adequately address. So again, ideally, if a new district were designed, and I'm not saying it will be, but if there were a new district to match the Uptown Edge place type, you end up with less nonconformity and more conducive environment for property owners than currently exists.
So here's my probably too simple of a vision. We've got an R1 zone in Uptown. Fair enough, and I can't tell you exactly where, but there's an R1 zone. What's that? Most of Uptown is R2. Okay, well, say it's R2. But within R2, you have some single family, you have some duplexes, you have some fourplexes. Fair enough? You can have, or bigger. Fair enough? So I know within R2 you can have a single family home. Fair enough? But you can't in R2 have multifamily. Correct? So my vision is you're going to correct that with a zone that allows for what's already there, but then we say we have a vacant parcel and somebody comes up and they want to put up a sixplex, and we're like, well, that's allowed. I think that's where you're going to get the blowback, right? Because they're going to like, well, no, we're in a...
The blowback from the public or the neighborhood or, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of my vision. Are you going to try to do the blanket it so that it all the existing uses are conforming? And then, but if you go forward with any kind of development, most of it's built up, but then is that where we're
Right.
gonna get resistance, or?
I mean, that's probably a good example where we would anticipate pushback because we're allowing maybe a higher intensity new development
And I think
than,
the answer is it's already there.
yes, exactly.
So why are we, but I'm
Right.
just anticipating where you're gonna hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the considerations that is part of this is, is everybody generally familiar with the concept of a form-based code? I know we talked about it a little bit through the comp plan, but anybody not familiar?
I would like a rundown, please.
Okay, great. So a true form-based code eliminates all consideration of uses and only focuses on the form of a structure, the design of a structure, its placement on a parcel, how it interacts with, the streetscape. We're not proposing that because a true form-based code requires what's called a regulating plan, which you don't have. Not the comprehensive plan and the Uptown Master Plan are not regulating plans. They don't build in a transect. And in our experience, a form-based code is a very complex regulatory document. But there are elements of form-based code that have been really successfully used by communities in this state and nationwide to better reflect character, design quality, and that's what we will be proposing that you consider as part of this update, looking at not just height and setback, but the massing of a building, how much of a building, particularly in Uptown, should have windows, where the entrance should be so that it's pedestrian oriented as well as serving, people in cars appropriately, landscaping requirements, design standards, so that where we see the pushback for some of the larger, more intense multifamily development in areas that are maybe less used to that happening, even if it exists already. Usually a lot of that has to do with poor design, some big ugly structure going in next to a single family home or a duplex that feels residential, and you get a cement wall next door. Through design standards and looking at form and just even some minimal requirements, we can address how that structure would look and feel and allay some of the concerns that the community might have and that the neighbors might have in terms of, what's happening next door. So right now, the code does not integrate. I mean, there are almost no design standards to guide the look and feel of development when it occurs. So we'd like to change that.
One thing I think I understand how your mind's working there, Mike, is the goal isn't on this subject and this subject only. No, so the goal isn't to just not create any non-conforming. We're going to attempt to match the character of that existing neighborhood. So any new construction should then fit, right? There will be some non-conforming. In areas like Uptown where there's a wide variety of use and a wide variety of design, the code will probably be pretty liberal in the regulation of that. And in areas on flat where it's single-family ranchers for blocks and blocks and blocks, it's probably going to be a little bit more restrictive in that fact. So the goal would be to match the character of the neighborhood, and by doing that, you should be not creating a lot of non-conformities there, but you will create some. It's not just we have a list of all these uses in this neighborhood, so now from this point forward, they're all allowed. It's, what does that, and it's really matching the plan that we did, so.
Allison, I have a few questions for your team. To your original question, what would you like to see? I guess I think they've already been said, but kind of in our historic district, make design standards that look and feel like they belong for a new structure. And then lighting was a good one that I forgot about. and then some basic stuff like sidewalks. When, I guess, can you talk about like at what point you're getting too prescriptive? Like, for example, I really love landscaping, but at some point, you know, you have 10 trees per square foot. Like, when is that too much? And then I guess just another question, just from your drive around, off the cuff, how many districts do you think we're gonna need or have or should have?
More than you have now?
Which is how many do we have now?
I think there's 13, 15. Yeah. There's like 4 and, yeah. 3 industrial.
Would
Yeah.
some be consolidated,
Some could be.
you know, and then before we create new?
Yep. You know, we're not proposing, we've definitely seen the opposite end of the spectrum where we've gone into communities and they have like 50 districts, and that is not something we would recommend. 34. In what? In Butte? No, there's not 34. There's not 34 districts. I don't believe you, Bert. that's, that's a lie.
I've got the list right here. If you count the R1, you have a R4 and a R4S, and a C1 and or a C2 and a C2L, et cetera. If you count all the sub-districts, you've got 26. That includes Ramsey, the districts in Ramsey. But if you categorize them into residential, commercial, industrial, you get down to your number that you...
I just counted the section in the codes and they're 19. So we will come back to you with the correct number of districts once we figure it out, apparently.
Yeah, I included Ramsey in mine, so
So
it
did
ran
I.
it up.
So I don't know.
There's the list.
Yeah. So somewhere between the hard part is that there's like you could have easily 15 districts in Uptown that encompass some of the well, I say that, and you could also have like one district in Uptown. It just kind of depends on how you want to approach the character discussion and intensity. I think when we were working on the comprehensive plan, the thought process behind the place types was that they would be reflected by a district or two. So I think there were, now I'm afraid to throw out a number, but I think there were on the order of about 20 place types, and I think a healthy and not excessive range for districts is like between 20 and 25 maybe. It's hard to put a number on that. We'll probably bounce back and forth quite a bit in figuring out, From experience, we usually start with a broader palette and then find opportunities to winnow down or consolidate just based on how they're actually applied and what makes the most sense. So, to your point about being too prescriptive, I think that there's definitely the ability to go into that realm of like number of trees and shrubs and height and for this exercise I don't think we'd be recommending any of that, because one of the things that we take under consideration is the capacity of staff. I mean, you have a very large county. Dillon has a very small staff. And even with the enforcement arm in not community enrichment, but we need to create a code that is easy to administer consistently, and that, all kind of factors into what is reasonable and rational and makes sense Counting trees, not really something that staff needs to waste their time on. So, you want to jump in?
I was just going to say that one alternative to getting too prescriptive is to have a set of guidelines and potentially offer incentives. So if you did do X amount of landscaping, you might be provided with some sort of incentive. So that's one tool that you can use without saying, this is what you have to have. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing you have to be careful about is being too prescriptive, for sure.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked that, it seems like there's a fine line. You know, if you're really prescriptive, you get what you want. If you're not prescriptive enough, you miss out on the stuff that you want. So I guess I'm sure you've dealt with that. I guess how you'll be recommending something like incentive or something like that to kind of walk that line.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance, and that's probably one of the things that we will be coming to you all for guidance through the drafting process to find that balance, because not everything we recommend is necessarily going to fly with you or with Dylan or the public, and so we've where we can allow flexibility and still get the outcome that you want, that's sort of our desired place to be, and whether that's through incentives, whether that is a combination of incentives and required standards, we have to kind of find where that makes the most sense for Butte.
Let me try to understand processes here. Let's say that you folks do what you're doing, and you're real happy with everything, and it's put into place, and so on and so forth. And a year down the road, somebody comes in and says, this doesn't make sense, what this board did in this particular area, asks for an exception. Is that available to the planning board to approve an exception and then send it on to the council of commissioners, or is what you guys do the be-all, end-all, and it's all over at that point? Is there flexibility for the planning board to come in and say, we agreed to this, but now looking back at it 2 years later, we're not so sure it made sense right here? Is there flexibility for us and for everybody else to come in and say, maybe that didn't make so much sense, maybe it was too broad at the time?
Yes. There will continue to be a variance process, an exception process. What we would aim to do is put some sidebars on that, so you all have clear parameters in terms of what you can consider variation to, and what's important that you maintain consistency in its application, just to get to those stated goals. So in terms of your ability and flexibility as a board to look case by case, you will still have that lever. But I think you're also speaking to, what if we just find out through application of the code in real time that something is just not working the way we thought it was going to work? That happens all the time. I mean, we are really good at what we do, but we can't always anticipate how something that is written in the code might be interpreted or applied in a way that is like, well, wait, this is not what we intended. Yeah. And it's really important that you all hear that when we deliver this code, when it hopefully is adopted, that does not mean it should not change for another 50 years. You should absolutely look at it every year or two and evaluate it based on what you're seeing come through the process. If you're seeing a lot of variance requests, that's usually a good indicator that your code's not working. And so make that change, but make it based on what you're seeing and kind of the reality of it being applied. And that's, we 100% support that, and tell all of our clients, like, don't look at this as a static document that you cannot touch.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you spoke to this already, I didn't write it down. Can you give us a high-level rundown of schedule and at what points we are going to be tasked with homework?
So, high level, our next step is to go home, synthesize the information we heard, continue to inform it with a stakeholder survey. That'll happen in the next month. We'll be working on a draft report that'll be ready for staff in October, and will probably come to you. Don't hold me to this, but I think our timeline right now is sometime in November, a draft recommendation. What? For the audit, yes, sorry, that's the audit report. That's just us saying, we think you need to do X, Y, and Z, or we think we need to do X, Y, and Z. Are you all in support of that? And here's why. Once we move through that process, there would be a public, kind of informational element to that. Once you're good with the recommendations and we take them out, so that we launch the update process that'll begin November, December, and carry through next spring. So you will be seeing, most likely me, and Dylan, and we'll kind of bring you updates on that process as it evolves and if we have questions for you. But in terms of your review, it will be probably April of next year before we have a full draft that's ready for prime time and ready for you to spend some time reading through it. And I think starting in April, we would probably be seeing you a little bit more consistently to work through the draft and get it ready for consideration for adoption. So.
Any further questions?
I feel like, and Dylan can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we had someone identified on our list. I don't believe they were in attendance yesterday, but.
We didn't have anybody from Ramsey on the list,
Oh, sorry.
but we will engage them. Yeah. Yeah, and lucky you guys are gonna be the ones that, once we get the text of the code updated, and, there's probably gonna be changes to existing districts, and there's gonna be some new districts, we're still gonna be left with the same map. So then we're gonna have to, us as a group, prioritize, what are we gonna change here, and then that's the notification process of notifying the individual landowners and all that. And this is, do you want to change your zoning designation to this zoning designation, or do you want to create one and stuff like that? So unfortunately, the 14 months that these guys are targeting is probably going to be extended quite for a while for us, because there's a lot of people that are waiting for this. And we're going to have to kind of prioritize, what areas we're going to target to then bring the map up to speed on that too. So that's a lot when Ramsey and Buxton and those kind of areas are going to become more involved. But they do need to be involved when we're creating that framework as well. But we're not going to, as part of this effort, change the boundaries.
If what you guys do in the way you rezone or whatever it is that you end up doing, would it, if we moved forward and had some sort of crystal ball, would it have had a direct impact on, say, Love's? Would it have a direct impact on say, the solar panel situation out there, wherever it was they wanted to do that? Will what you do have impacts on, though, I would assume it would, but would it have impacted it had this been in place, say, 2 years ago?
The Love situation is kind of a unique one, so I don't know, because
But you've mentioned Ramsey numerous times.
Yep.
And certainly, zoning out in that area
Mhm.
would have to be impacted with that.
Yeah, but if I'm not mistaken, the Loves was
Yeah,
compliant with the
um,
zoning.
in,
And I don't mean to go down the road
Yeah.
in particular with just Loves and take us down that
Yeah.
rabbit hole, but I'm just talking in broad terms.
this, in broad terms, when we get the code updated and is right and is fitting for the community, it will be a lot easier for good development and will be a lot stricter against poor development for our community as far as community goals.
Okay.
From a broad perspective, that's probably the best
That
way
answers
that I
my
can describe it.
That's-
Good development is just outright permitted, and if it's something that's taking advantage of neighbors or isn't quite what Butte wants, then it's just outright prohibited.
So Dylan, maybe a follow-up on that then is after the 14 months and, they're going forward, is it our hope that we do zone the entire county?
That is not the goal or intent. We've historically let citizens guide where zoning happens, and it's my goal to continue to do that. But if, neighborhood groups come forward, like Buxton, I'm sure probably will, then we have that a designation for them that they'll fit into, and then we can just do the map change like we've been doing, the last 5 or 6 times as that goes on. And you set up signs and notify all the landowners and send out letters and, have them all come speak and stuff like that.
Sharpen the torches and pitchfork.
I guess I'm just thinking you could head off a lot of problems if Love comes in and says, we want to do this, it's not zoned for it, and it's end of discussion, right there. I mean, go ahead and ask for a variance, but it's not zoned for it, end of discussion, the solar panel thing. It is zoned for it, put it in. Good, end of discussion. No fight, I mean, they can come in here and argue, I guess, if they want to, but it's not zoned for it, or it is zoned for it, and it just seems like it would take care of a whole lot of arguing and paying attorneys up the yin-yang, and it would just be kind of
So the
black
goal,
and white.
the goal is to have community input at the plan stage and some at the code stage, and then with the development stage, I'm not into having a development review board. I don't want to look at every individual development and make a one-off decision of that's good for the community or not. The code and the plan already reflect that. That's when we've talked to everybody. That's when you get your input as a community, is developing the plan and the rules and regulations. And then when the development comes, I am totally against filling this room full of people, at the development stage. It's not good for anybody. So, yeah, that's the goal, is to get a very reflective plan of our community goals, and there's a no risk thing. It's a yes or no.
Yeah, it would seem to make things a lot easier for everybody.
I have nothing else that's good enough. Yeah,
Very
thanks for the
interesting. Thank you.
presentation.
Yeah.
We've had a good week with Allison and her team, and I think the response so far has been very positive. And to be honest, I am really excited. In my mind, we are 14 months down the road already, and this is done, and life is good. And I'm not in the Montana Standard anymore, and things just get permitted or not. So no, it's going to be. I might be biased coming from the planning department, but this is going to be one of the bigger things that have happened in the community in a long time.
Cool. Thank you guys for traveling from very far away, and
Thank
you as
you.
well, Allison.
Yeah.
Thank you for presenting.
ER, you still have the OR?
I'm not showing that picture.